That'll be, you got some money on you now.
Yeah, thank you very much.
There's a fee for that.
Now, getting into more, and this is where we can see your beautiful, I'm going to call it a poster, Terrifying Transference. This is your latest book, and all your books, and I've read them all, of course, have really, in my mind, talked about, as what you've coined the term, the organizing period, or the organizing transference. Let's talk about the beginning of life, and how you understand that, and how you've expressed it so well in your books, and how it relates to really all of us.
Well, all right, let's continue then on the trail. We were talking about the 4 or 5 year old trail, and how the child is interested in family relationships and retains emotional imprints from that period. And then we talked at more or less the 3-year-old period, where the child is retaining imprints on how I learn to feel affirmed as a self. And we all need to feel affirmed as a self every day, and so we have certain ways, and some of them are left over from 3-year-old way, and some of them are more mature. So in a consulting room, we're trying to listen to what those patterns are. When we get down to the 2-year-old period, it's sort of mommy and me interactions, and it's not that mommy is the exclusive caretaker during that period, especially not the way we raise children now, but we talk about really bonding. So whatever the emotional invested relationships are at that time period, the child just learns sort of automatic character responses to that, which we carry with us. But what the period that has been the most difficult for us to try to unearth is the period that is pre-bonded. Now, what exactly do we mean by bonded? Or Margaret Mahler's word for it, which she borrowed from biology, was symbiosis. That is, by the 4th month, moving to the 24th month, we have children bonding actively.
So a 4-month-old infant we're talking about
is busy bonding with mother and every other invested person in the household, usually to a lesser extent. And so if the biological mother is available, she's almost invariably the primary bonding person of choice, because there's been a long in utero history.
Sure.
But bonding happens with the family dog, as well as other siblings and anyone else that's invested in the relationship. So the 4 to 24-year-old period is that period of bonding, and the way that we first learn to bond is the way we look for other emotional bonds later. But prior to that bonding, when the bonding takes hold, there is another period.
And the period is?
I call it the organizing period, and if we wanted to have dates on it, we would say probably the last trimester of pregnancy through the 3rd or 4th month of life. So we've got a 7 or 8 month window, and the numbers are obviously arbitrary.
Sure.
But by the last trimester, we now know that babies are alive to what's going on not only in the womb, but in the world around them. And we're aware, as our infant research exposes them to various sounds and to various chemical changes in the mother's blood, we know that babies are exquisitely sensitive.
I remember right before Shauna was born, when my wife was pregnant, I would walk in and I would talk, and Shauna would push her hand out, or Eleanor would touch her stomach and begin playing with the baby in uterally.
Yeah. And parents now are very much aware of this, so they're busy every night reading to the child, talking to the child, and by now, because of amniocentesis, we usually know whether the child is a boy or a girl, and the child already has a name. And so we find parents massaging the child, responding. So a lot of interactions are now going on between parents and babies that are still in the womb. And so the bonding period begins there. But the reason I chose to call this period organizing is because really from conception, the child begins organizing channels to the environment. So we have the fetus at the earliest stages organizing channels in utero to the mother's body. And they're mostly biochemical, electrical channels that sustain the child for the first period in the womb. And we don't have any way of saying exactly when emotional, psychological life begins, but certainly in the last trimester we have reason to believe that psychological life has begun.
Or maybe another word for awareness.
Awareness in various ways has begun. So somehow then the child is now beginning to organize channels not just to the maternal body, but to the maternal mind and to other minds that are present. And children don't think the way we do, they're aware of stimulation, and so they begin responding to it. And so by the time the child is born, the child then begins actively noticing other people and begins to figure out ways of reaching out to mother. By the 4th month, we're quite aware, we can observe that the child is already beginning to interact, beginning to want things, demand things, expect things, smile upon
noticing the
command.
mother walks in the room, for example.
All of these things are very
Right.
clear. So as observers, we don't know when to say bonding begins, but it starts early. And by bonding, all we mean is that there's a two-way street of interaction.
Got it.
So that as you and I interact, at all points, I'm sort of paying attention to you. Like if we were playing a ball, I'd throw the ball to you and you'd adjust and I'd adjust and we'd...
I drop it, Sean would pick it up and throw
There
it
we
back.
go.
Okay.
So we adapt to one another.
Sure.
And children learn to do that. And we can observe them doing it, presuming that everything is developing normally, by the third or fourth month. And yet, how did the baby begin to establish those channels, those emotional channels? So, as we begin to use the central concept of transference, which is that we all transfer from our early childhood emotional patterns from the family, from the self, from the mommy and me, and now,
at this level,
what kind of pattern might be transferred here?
so you're saying what kind of pattern will be transferred from 4 months and under onto the other,
Later
or
relationships.
the world. Or
Later
the world,
relationships. Yeah. So we probably spent 100 years asking that question in lots of ways. And I think we've got a fairly good working answer at this point in time. And I guess there's a lot of ways to talk about it, but the British pediatrician Donald Winnicott has given me the way that sticks in my mind, and that's easiest to say. Winnicott had probably observed more mother-baby dyads than anybody else in the world, because his entire lifetime he interviewed mothers and babies. And then later in his life he became a psychoanalyst. He said that in the early in utero experience, and when the baby also is in mother's arms, that the experience of just going on being, of things just happening because the child needs something. The child is hungry and suddenly the chemicals come from the umbilicus, or a nipple is put in the baby's mouth. And so during this time period, the child's needs are just more or less taken care of. But at some point the child begins to enliven herself or himself to the world around and begins actually reaching towards those sources of nurturance, of comfort, of tension relief, of evacuation, of all the things that are important to babies. And so in organizing channels that work for that baby, there's a lot of different ways that any baby might do it. The metaphor I've used is, imagine a baby born with 1,000 invisible tendrils reaching in all directions, trying to latch on to the mind and body of mother and then others after that. And the question would be, if everything goes well and the baby learns to latch on to get what's needed and move on in life, how many of those tendrils might have to latch on? And for a long time I pulled the number out of the hat. I said, well, maybe 300. If you got 300 little tendrils on mother, you got hold of her, and you can go ahead and develop, because you know how to hold on to mother. The infant researchers Tronick and Cohn have demonstrated just that in their video studies, where they have two video cameras like this with a mother and a baby, and then you show them on the screen side by side, the mother's face and the baby's face, so that we can then watch what's going on and have researchers do frequency counts. The frequency counts are of the times that the baby seems to be wanting to make some kind of connection with mother. 30% of the time the connection is made. So actually the parents who are watching can be relieved that 30% connecting with the child is good enough. And when we go to you, Dave, 30% of connecting to your granddaughter is good enough.
That's good.
And yet there's a great many babies that don't quite get the 30%, and children that don't get the 30% of connecting when they need it, when they want it. So then the question would be, what happens to those other 70%? What happens to all the channels, the tendrils that don't connect in a satisfying way?
So we used the metaphor of 1,000, 300 channels, tendrils connect, and 700 don't. What happens to those 700 tendrils?
And that's going to be our question, and it's going to lead us to the answer to the transference question, because whatever happens to those 700 tendrils that didn't make it is going to leave an imprint on the body's neurological system, which is the beginning of psyche, the beginning of its mind. And so again, to try to describe or to try to imagine what that must be like for an infant, I have another sort of metaphor, and I do it with my hands. I think there's really maybe, I say two ways, there's dozens of ways, but for clarification, I talk about reaching and reaching and reaching, trying to find.
Right.
And if there's nothing there, nobody there, I mean, that tendril just begins to wither.
So we have a 3-month-old reaching and reaching and reaching.
And nobody there.
And it's been assumed the experience is terror if there's nothing there, or certainly if there's something abusive. And of course the tendril will either wither, or if it's abusive, just immediately pull back.
Well, that's the other one. If I'm reaching, 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 and then I get slapped, then I go back. So there's the withered tendril, and there's the constricted, tightly tendril. So the withered tendril, if there's a lot of those, you kind of fall into a slump. We've got kind of chronic fatigue, chronic depression, lack of energy. And if there's the constriction, we've got more the withdrawn in terror and holding on for dear life, holding on for tight. And we've got 700 variations in between.
Right.
So in a way, all of us then have met a variety of disappointing, frustrating, unsatisfying experiences during babyhood, no matter how good the caretaking was. And the imprint then that is going to be left in transference has something to do with what is my reaction to unmet responsiveness. And so when I come to you later in life and want an emotional response to you, what am I already assuming about parts of me that would really like to reach out and relate to you?
Sure.
That are not going to be met, or that are going to be hurt. And so I kind of have a shell, I kind of have a bit of a wall around me, so that in 700 out of 1,000 ways, I don't reach. Because on this tendril that's reaching in this way, when it comes back, what I've learned basically is never reach that way again.
So you internalize a message that says, never go there again.